Happily Ever After is an interesting idea. From a fairy tale perspective, it seems to be like a writer telling their audience, these characters are happy now and will be forever, so don't worry about them. But is that what a real happily ever after would look like? This was a thought that had crossed Freya Sparks' mind when she awoke one morning, and, as she had every morning for months now, set herself into a state of joy, choosing to think about things she was grateful for and thinking about what kind of person she was going to be that day. Freya still had many spurts of anger, frustration, annoyance, sadness, and fear, but she also knew irrefutably she was so much better off now than she had been in a very long time. To remind her of that, she'd often pull up interviews or footage from her previous Vigilants tournaments. As impressive as her fighting skills with her electrokinetic abilities were, she could feel the sadness and anxiety that was near constantly lingering in her in those days when she watched the old footage. It made her sad for her old self, but reminded her how much better things had become. She was in a particularly good mood on that day as she woke up in a large, soft hotel suite bed in the island country of Unitalia. She had finally made it to the Unitalia Invitational Tournament. As she had to most events in the last few months, she'd brought her friend and mentor, Carter Sahayek. His advice and positive influence had helped make all the happiness Freya was feeling possible, and she was excited to have him there to witness in person as she won her first ever tournament in Unitalia. Being the Global Vigilance champion, she had dozens of tournament wins under her belt, but this was going to be different. She could feel it. 2 days before the tournament began, she stopped training to ensure she didn't get any injuries and let her body rest in final preparation. This wasn't an old habit of hers, but one that she had taken on that felt very beneficial. It also meant, though, she didn't have much to do in those next few days before the tournament. When she met up with Carter for breakfast that day, he encouraged her to come with him to meet the organizers of another, smaller tournament in Unitalia Freya had agreed to go to after the Invitational, called the Unitalia Vigilants Exhibition Tournament. She wasn't nearly as focused on it, but was intrigued enough. It was going to be her first time trying a doubles match where she'd fight alongside a pro fighter named Wallop Beaton, against two others, Chadwick Geigar and Flamtatius Staphos. Freya had beaten all three of them in tournaments before, and would be facing them again in the Invitational. She hoped they'd all still be in good spirits for their doubles match, after she thumped them all beforehand. At that breakfast, Carter had gone on and on about how excited he was to meet this organizer, Chanel Fuego, who'd reached out to him to get Freya into the exhibition tournament. Carter and Chanel had spoken on the phone many times since that first call. Freya could tell that when Carter had a crush, he was not at all good at hiding it. You know, Freya, we're also going to be meeting Chanel's brother, Trayton. He's going to be running security at the event because he's a very handsome and very hardworking Protection Bureau officer. He's also not that much older than you. Freya rolled her eyes at him. Are you trying to set me up with the brother of a girl you haven't even met in person yet? Maybe, if everything Chanel says about him is true, which it must be because she's amazing and wonderful, then he could very well be a great fit for you. Now that you've got your mental health on track, it could be worth considering getting into a relationship, if you feel so inclined. She shrugged. I don't know, I haven't dated anyone in so long and never really had good experiences with it. Plus, really a Protection Bureau officer with me? Carter tilted his head curiously. What does that mean? What makes you think that wouldn't work? You know, lots of Protection Bureau officers are so judgy about Vigilance competitors because we use our powers for show instead of, to protect people like them. Carter smirked. So you're preemptively judging him for being judgmental because you're concerned about the possibility of being judged by him? Sounds a bit like the old Freya to me, not the mature, happy new you. She thought for a moment, then sighed with an irritated grin. Do you always have to be right about everything? I don't have to be, but it's just a habit at this point. Freya went with Carter and did meet Chanel and her work partner, Kaya Palaya. They talked about the exhibition tournament, who was coming, and thanked Freya a few dozen times for agreeing to compete in a tournament with no proven history. Freya was kind, albeit a bit quiet, But that was alright because most of the talking was done between Chanel and Carter, who spoke as if they'd known each other for 50 lifetimes and were practically reading each other's thoughts. Soon enough, though, they were also introduced to Trayton. He'd been doing rounds of the event site to figure out where security would need to be placed. When Freya saw him, her heart did jump. He was extremely handsome, especially in his Protection Bureau uniform, walking at a fast, confident stride. A part of her was still convinced he'd have the judgmental attitude she'd always anticipated from a Protection Bureau officer. Until he got close enough and noticed her. His steady stride vanished and he suddenly tripped over himself, but quickly regained his composure, though his walk seemed immediately less confident than it had a moment ago. He got close and Chanel said, "All good, Trey?" Yes, everything seems to be in order so far," he replied. Chanel then said, "Trayton, this is Carter, the one I was telling you about." Trayton gave Carter a firm handshake, but seemed a bit distracted. Then Chanel continued, "And obviously, as you already know, this is Freya Sparks." Freya held out her hand and Carter started to bow or something, but then stopped awkwardly and held out his hand too, meeting her gaze, then looking away, then looking back, as if he had no idea how to conduct himself anymore. "Hi, Miss Sparks. It's really nice to meet you. I hope it's not weird for me to say, but I've been a huge fan of yours for a while now. It's a massive honor to have you in our country, and especially competing in Chanel's tournament." Freya suddenly blushed. "Oh, thank you. I'm excited to be here." Chanel put a hand on Trayton's shoulder. "You should have seen his face when I told him you were coming. I thought he was going to pass out from excitement. You know, he has a poster of you in his locker at the protection." Trayton's whole face went beet red as he put a hand over Chanel's mouth. "Okay, sis, that's enough of that." Soon after, Trayton seemed to get used to the fact that he was talking to his celebrity crush. He started asking her about her most recent combat techniques, comparing them with the tactics used by Protection Bureau officers. There wasn't a stitch of judgment coming from him, and the two of them spent nearly an hour talking about the similarities between their work. Freya got so lost in the conversation that she hadn't even noticed that the rest of the group had wandered off. When she did notice, Freya said, "Oh, should we meet back up with the others again?" Trayton checked his watch. "Wow, I didn't realize we'd been talking that long, but by now Chanel and Carter are probably off on their date. Don't tell him I said this, but my sister pretty much thinks Carter is her soulmate already. She can be a bit overly optimistic." Freya smirked. Well then, she might be right, because Carter has been talking the same way about her. They both laughed, then that faded into a pause in the conversation. Trayton suddenly started acting flustered again. I don't know if you have, or I'm sure you have lots to do in preparation for the tournament, but if you are still free, now or for the next few hours, would you like to get food with me? I know a few great restaurants in the area." Freya's heart started to pound. An instinct kicked up in her to just run away. It was as if she wanted to go get Carter so he could tell her what she was supposed to do. But after a moment of pause, she realized she knew what to do. Exactly what she wanted to. Of course, her long pause made Trayton think he'd stepped out of line. "I am so sorry, that was very unprofessional of me. You probably get guys asking you out all the time." "Oh, no. Sorry, yes, let's go. That sounds nice." He relaxed again and smiled. She could practically see the anxiety melting off him, and she couldn't help but laugh. They went off and had a fantastic meal, but Freya got so lost in the conversation that she barely noticed the food anyway. They agreed to meet up again after the Invitational, which Trayton had already taken time off work for the next week to come watch. Freya wasn't as overly romantic as Carter, but she started to relate to him a bit, as she too was already having thoughts of spending much more time with Trayton. Thankfully though, she was still able to get her head in the game as the Invitational Tournament began. Freya had designed herself a new outfit for the event, and hadn't made it as bare as the one that almost kept the tournament's uptight organizers from allowing her to come to the tournament. Part of her wanted to go even more revealing just to really stick it to them, but she'd also realized she would only be doing that out of spite, not because it was actually what she wanted to wear. She was sure some people would say that she made a less revealing outfit just to appease the tournament organizers, but Thankfully, she'd gotten much better at not worrying so much about what others thought of her. As she started into the tournament, her first fight was far more difficult than anticipated. She was put immediately up against Flamtatious Staphos, one of the fighters she'd go up against again in the doubles match at the next tournament. Staphos was an extremely agile fighter who could manifest bars in the air around him to use as either staff weapons or to swing from to fling himself through the air. She went into the fight anticipating agility-based moves, but because Staphos had been training with Chadwick Geigar, one of the world's best heavy-hitting brawlers, he'd gotten much more proficient with brawling combat since the last time she and Flamtatious had fought. Freya did dip back into her old fighting style partway through the match, using her electrical resistance field to slow him down for a while and tire him out. It worked and she was able to win the match, but afterwards it didn't feel like a satisfying victory because she defaulted to her old ways of fighting just to ensure she'd get the win. She swore in the next fights she wouldn't do that again. She was determined to win, but not by fighting in her old repetitive ways. She was going to put on a show. And that she did. Her next 4 fights over the next few days would stack tons of fuel for highlight reels of the tournament. Freya was using different tactics in every fight and was both having a blast herself and was getting the crowd roaring. At one point in her 3rd fight, she even noticed Trayton in the crowd. She was so high from the fight that after she landed the final blow on her opponent, she winked at him flirtatiously. Seconds later, she felt very embarrassed for having done it, but he saw her after that day's events and had clearly been thrilled about it. Near the end of the week, Freya made it into the semifinals, going up against Chadwick Geigar, the other opponent she'd face in doubles at the exhibition. He was a nice guy and had actually helped Freya get into this tournament, but he also had a score to settle with her. The last time she'd beaten him was in the Global Vigilants League tournament, and after she'd beat him, he'd gone on the biggest losing streak of his career. He'd since trained with Staphos though, so while Chadwick was known for being one of the world's toughest powerhouse brawlers, Freya knew he'd gotten a lot more agile. When they shook hands before the fight, Chadwick said,
"Glad you got this far, Sparks, but get ready. You ain't fighting the same Chadwick Geigar as last time."
She smirked. Good, because that guy was too easy. He laughed enthusiastically and they both moved back into their ends. Arenas could be set up differently for different fighters, but this one was a fairly traditional rocky terrain. The center field was fairly flat, but around that, before the walls, were some 3 to 12 foot tall rocky spikes and mounds for the fighters to leap off of, hurl their opponents into, or even break off and use as weapons. Freya knew Chadwick was likely to be tossing some of them at her eventually. The bell rang, but neither fighter charged in. They both waited to see how the other would move first. Freya then started jogging slowly forward, still waiting to see how Geigar would respond. He was on his toes, dancing back and forth. When Freya was halfway across the field, he darted to the side towards one of the biggest rocky spikes. Freya switched to her resistance field so she could slow any coming projectiles. But none came yet. Chadwick smashed the pillar from the bottom, breaking it free, then did the same to the next one, and the next, and the next. He was both leveling out the field, while also making dozens of possible weapons he could hurl at her later in the fight. Freya quickly switched into her combat field, but as soon as she did, instead of breaking the next pillar, Chadwick kicked off of it with incredible speed and soared towards Freya. She noticed in time to switch back to her resistance field, but chose not to. She tested her own might against Geigar's and swung a sparking fist at his head. She hit hard, but his burly body wasn't thrown off course enough to miss her, and he tackled her to the ground, both of them rolling across the arena. Freya sprung up quickly and shot a concentrated beam of lightning at Geigar. He flung himself off his hands 30 feet into the air, combining his strength and newfound agility in brilliant unison. Freya thought he'd given himself too much airtime though. She shot a beam of lightning at him again, but before it could strike, he clapped his hands towards the sky as hard as he could. The force was enough to launch him towards the ground, out of the path of the shock. He slammed to the ground next to Freya, leapt up, and struck her with his signature move, the triple aura punch. 2 glowing green fists appeared over his own, and in quick succession all 3 struck her, sending Freya soaring backwards like a sparking rocket. She crashed right into the wall of the arena, instantly feeling dizzy. She'd never taken a full force hit from someone as strong as Geigar, and it hurt far more than she'd expected. When she was back on the ground and on her feet, she immediately saw a mound of rock flying towards her. She switched to resistance to slow it, stepped aside, and let it strike the wall behind her. It broke into pieces, and Freya caught the biggest of them, then switched to combat and hurled it back at Gygar, who was readying up another throw himself. He dropped his rock to catch the one flying towards him, but Freya sprinted up behind it, building up a sparking fist of lightning around her hand, almost looking like Gygar's own move. The crowd exploded into cheers as Freya struck Gygar and sent him rolling back across the arena. As he skidded to a stop, he stood up and chuckled.
Seems like I'm not facing the same Freya Sparks I did before neither.
Despite Freya taking such a hard hit so early on, their fight went on for an hour. Near its end, they were both exhausted. Gygar was practically passing out, and Freya thought she saw the perfect moment to land a final blow. Gygar seemed to trip over himself, and his hand fell onto a toppled stone spike to keep him upright. She used all the strength she had to launch forward in combat mode, swinging her fist with everything she had left. But that was what Gygar had wanted. He gripped and raised the large stone right between them, and Freya punched that instead of him. When the debris of it shattering cleared, Freya saw the glow of Gygar's triple aura punch. Then she blacked out. She awoke a moment later on the ground with her whole body aching. A referee was there to help her up. She sat up and saw the crowd cheering, with Gygar's hand being held in the air by another ref. The win was his. Freya had lost in the semifinals. An hour or so later, Freya was out of medical checks and in her change room when a knock came on the door. She told him to come in, knowing already that it was Carter. He entered with an upbeat but also concerned look as he saw tears rolling down Freya's face. Before saying anything, he came and sat next to her. He was quiet for a moment before asking, "Do you want sympathy, advice, or to be left alone?" Surprisingly, though, Freya kind of chuckled. None of the above, I guess? I'm actually good." Carter leaned forward to look at her face. "Are you?" She nodded, wiping a tear away. "I am annoyed that I lost the tournament. It would have been cool to win my first time coming to Unitalia, but I'm not crying because I'm sad. I'm crying because, for once, I'm actually okay with the fact that I'm sad. It used to be that if I got really low, I'd get scared because I'd have no idea how long it was going to last. It could be a few days, could be weeks or months. I just never knew how long I'd be miserable. Then being scared of how long it would last just made it even worse. Now it's just kind of like, yeah, I'm sad, and that's okay because I know I'm better at being happy now, and this'll pass soon. So I'm just gonna let myself be sad and be fine with that." Carter started happily tearing up, hearing that. Another moment later, she said, "I used to think happiness was just something I was never really gonna have again. I don't know if I'll ever be able to thank you enough for helping me get here, Carter." "I didn't do this, Freya. You did it yourself. I just gave you the information you needed to do it. But if you do want to do something to thank me, then there's only one thing you actually have to do. Pass the advice along. When you find someone else in the same low place you were in, tell them how you decided to get better and then how you did it. Make the happiness contagious." Tears started coming again as she replied, "I will." After another moment of content pause, Carter said, "Also, if you want to pay me back, you can be the best man at my wedding to Chanel because we're definitely getting married one day." She laughed. "You are such a psycho. There is no denying it at this point. We're soulmates. Maybe we could even have a doubles wedding, me and Chanel and you and Trayton." She shoved him to the side. "Oh my god, you have to stop right now. I just met him." "It's gonna happen. There is no stopping it now." Freya and Carter chatted and joked for a while longer, and soon enough, as expected, Freya's disappointment about the tournament faded. She even enjoyed watching the other semi-final, as Wallop Beaton, the now underdog, won his fight, and then went on the next day to beat Chadwick Gygar, taking his first tournament win in a long time. Freya knew that Wallop winning the tournament was a bigger victory for him and his home country of Australia than it would have been for her. She was genuinely happy for him, and it just made her all the more excited to fight alongside him in their upcoming doubles match. The tournament hadn't gone the way she thought she wanted, and yet, by its end, she wouldn't have had it any other way. She had fun, and would just be all the more determined to win it the next time she was invited. Freya realized after that day that the real version of happily ever after doesn't mean you're continuously happy all the time forever. It means that even when the low moments come, you've got such a powerful love for yourself and for your life that the lows can't possibly stick around that long. Freya knew she had gotten really skilled at being happy, so no matter what came in the future, or even at the upcoming Unitalia exhibition tournament the next week, she was going to live an exciting, fun, and happy life. I hope you all enjoyed the third episode of Freya Sparks' story, which does wrap up her character arc for this season, but she will be returning for the 2-part season finale of Vigilants, which is coming up very soon because there's only one more episode before we get to that, which will be another Bayou Nights episode before we get to the finale. Even though there's a lot of differences between me and Freya Sparks, her arc has way more relation to my personal real-life character arc than any other character I've ever written, so this was a really satisfying and emotional story to wrap up for me personally. If you enjoy Vigilance, please like, subscribe, follow, share it with anyone you think might also enjoy it, or just check out another episode if you haven't heard them all. Thanks and goodbye for now.